All right, we're going to continue our walk through this Move to Global War case study of Japan, and with today's talk about Japanese expansion in Asia. This is our first video of two that's going to deal with Japanese expansion from 1931 until 1939. Now we've got to start this talk with the political instability over in China. China has been very much a divided nation since the fall of the Qing dynasty, but Zheng Jixi, the leader of a nationalist movement called the Kuomintang or the GMD, is going to move in the 1920s to unify China. In 1926, he launches what's called the Northern Expedition, where he's going to send his armies to the north of China to try to bring in territories that are not under his control yet, up to and including Manchuria. There's also going to be a split in this Northern Expedition movement between the Kuomintang, led by Zheng Jixi, and the Chinese Communist Party, led by Mao Zedong. That'll ultimately lead to a civil conflict, a civil war between those factions. So Zheng Jixi's hopes of creating this truly unified China are not working out very well. There's also political instability in Japan. There's the growing disagreements between the political leadership, the emperor and prime ministers, and the military, and who's ultimately pulling the strings with regard to Japanese foreign policy. And this comes to a head when a Manchurian warlord named Zhang Zhou would have his own desires to push into to China to try to unify more territory under his control. Remember that Qing dynasty that had previously ruled China for the last nearly 300 years was a Manchurian dynasty that had controlled China. Japan does not want to see this. Japan does not want to see a powerful Manchuria that unites with China. So the Japanese military, called the Kwangtung Army, it's the Japanese army that's based in Korea and Manchuria, will move against Zhang Zhou and assassinate him without the emperor's sanction. This is that first sign that the Japanese political authority does not actually have control of the Japanese military. And then we get the Great Depression. Beginning in 1929 in the United States, but impacting every country in the world that does business overseas, the Great Depression is going to be devastating to Japan, whose economy relied on both imports from outside and the ability to export Japanese manufactured goods. The United States will launch a harsh protective tariff against imported goods in Japan called the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act. This is going to increase the price of Japanese imports 200% in the United States. And those Japanese exports are going to be crushed. Silk exports, for example, are going to be absolutely crushed, which leads to a spike in unemployment in the nation of Japan. So we are adding political discontent now with economic discontent. This Great Depression pushes the Japanese military and more in the Japanese political leadership to feel the need to acquire their own raw materials, to not have to rely on a country like the United States for steel or oil or any other raw materials. And Japan sees Manchuria as the place that it can get that. Now, Manchuria is this massive tract of land north of Korea in East Asia. Japan sees it as living space for an ever-growing Japanese population. And we're going to see that phrase come up a couple more times in this unit. And a source for raw materials that Japan desperately needs. The Kwangtung Army that is based in Korea and Manchuria is going to move to seize Manchuria against the emperor's wishes. This is going to begin with what is known as the Mukden Incident, because it happens outside of this Manchurian town called Mukden, where there's an explosion at a Japanese-owned railway. And let's go back for a second. What's Japanese army and Japanese railways doing in Manchuria? These go way back to concessions that Japan had gained from China after the Sino-Japanese War back in 1894. So Japan had business interests in Manchuria. Japan had armies stationed in Asia to defend their business interests. And now that army, that Kwangtung Army, is going to claim that this attack on a railway was actually done by the Chinese and they will use this as their what we call a casus belli, a reason for war, to move against Manchuria and to seize that territory. By early 1932, Manchuria is completely under Japanese control. Fighting will also break out in the Chinese city of Shanghai. The Japanese air forces will bomb the city, and ultimately, Zheng Jixi and China will concede control of Manchuria over to Japan with what is known as the Treaty of Tangu in May of 1933. This will make Manchuria essentially a puppet state of Japan. It will be renamed Manchukuo, takes on a Japanese name. Puyi will be placed as the emperor of Manchukuo. Puyi was the last Qing dynasty emperor. He was a young boy as he was the emperor of China, and he's going to be put in charge of this puppet government in Manchuria by the Japanese. To give, a local ruler that has some notoriety, to give a positive public face to what Japan was really doing in Manchuria. By Zheng Jixi's part, he hoped that Manchuria would be enough for Japan, that they wouldn't push any further, and that it would be so difficult for Japan to actually hold on to Manchuria, it would ultimately force them to back out. And Zheng Jixi, at this point in 1933, his thinking is that his rivalry with the communists, with Mao Zedong and the communists, is actually more important to deal with in the immediate than Japan. In fact, Zheng Jixi would say that Japan was a disease of the skin, while the communists were a disease of the heart. So it was much more important to deal with the communists first. Results of this crisis: it is going to deepen tensions between Japan and Western powers. It will be condemned by the League of Nations, and we'll talk more about that in a later video. It is an abandonment of Japanese internationalism. Remember the moves that Japan was making in the 1920s to try to work with other nations of the world. That is done. The GMD will focus on defeating the CCP in China. Japan absolutely will benefit from the resources that Manchuria can provide it, and we now definitively see that Japan's military was pulling the strings of the democratically elected government and even the emperor. That's all for today. We'll see you next time for part 2 of Japan's expansion in Asia.